Thank you, Gary. It's been great working with P&G, and we look forward to continuing this work with them in Mumbai on October 15th for the Bloomberg Equality Summit that we'll be doing there. So I have Hannah and Jake Graf.
Hi.
As Gary said, you're like a power trans couple now. That's how you're built, which I think is actually kind of a remarkable sign, maybe, of progress. I don't know. How do you feel when you hear yourselves described that way?
I mean, it's one of those things. I mean, it's obviously it's a compliment. It's obviously very nice. I think it's just a matter of circumstance. I think that Jake and I have been given that title. But I think it's amazing that, like you say, we live in a world where there is such thing as a power couple of transgender people at all, because there was a long time ago when transgender people weren't even recognised in society. Right. So I think it shows we're very privileged to be called that, but I think the fact that anyone's being called that is the main thing.
Also, bearing in mind there isn't that much competition for that for that prize, but yes, we are obviously very proud and very honoured to be referred to in that way.
Okay. I do, as John Micklethwaite said in the morning, we like to bring data into these conversations, and I want to do what we're kind of calling the Bloomberg reality check. So get out your phones, because we're going to do a poll. I'll give you a second. Are you ready? Okay, here's the poll, if you can see it right. So what percentage of transgender people in the UK have experienced a hate crime or incident because of their gender identity in the last 12 months? And your options are 15%, 27%, 33%, and 41%. Okay. I haven't told Jake and Hannah, they may know the answer to this, but I haven't talked about it with them. What would you say?
I would say from the experience speaking to my friends, particularly my trans female friends, and particularly with the young trans kids that Hannah and I work with as patrons for the Mermaids charity, that it's probably the highest. In fact, I'm surprised it's not higher than 41%.
You're correct. It's 41%, which I thought was actually quite a high number. And I think shows, right here we have kind of the best of worlds and the worst of worlds. We have, you're not invisible. Trans people are no longer invisible, but the consequences also, I think we still have a lot of work to do to ensure the protection of those people.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
No, go ahead.
I don't know what I was going to say. I was just going to say it's 41%. I mean, I've had it, and I know lots of our friends have had it, and I think like I say, it's a bit of a backlash, right? Which is that in the last few years, we've made this great spring forward in transgender equality. A lot more transgender people are out there as role models, etc. But then, a bit like we saw with the Gillette advert, there's always that backlash, and it's usually from a more silent majority. Sorry, a minority of people, but they're very vocal, and so we've got to kind of get over that and get past it, and so we become everyday people in society.
It is true, though. I mean, I've sort of largely avoided that because as a trans man, because of my physicality largely, most people can't tell that I'm trans. And so I walk through life with a fairly, no one would really know. I'm kind of under the radar if I choose to be. But trans women who kind of, I guess largely because of their physicality historically, because, they're often slightly taller or maybe have slightly bigger hands or a deeper voice. These are people who've had to fight for their rights, who've had to fight for their safety. And whereas a lot of trans guys kind of can slide under the radar and choose to have that sort of invisible, quiet lifestyle, I think, for Hannah and I, it's really important because I grew up with no positive role models whatsoever, purely because trans men can live under the radar. And so for us, it's really important that we're out there because, obviously if the younger generation has nothing to look up to and no view of hope and no view of the possibilities of being trans and living a happy, productive lifestyle, then obviously, for them during their formative years, that can only be detrimental.
It's also worth pointing out that those statistics increase when they start to intersect with other minorities.
Right.
So particularly trans women of colour
right.
Are kind of the most at-risk demographic.
Right. So once again, women bear the disproportionate effects, negative effects of societal issues.
Did you know, Mark, actually, that the average life expectancy of a transgender woman of colour in the US is 35 years old?
And what happens?
Unfortunately, I mean, it does stem a lot from sort of, cultural backgrounds and so on, but, that quite often it seems that men fall in love with them, and men are quite happy in those relationships until family and friends start saying, are you gay, are you queer, that's not a woman, that's a man. And then quite often, because again of sort of cultural and societal pressures, these men then turn on the women that they essentially love, and quite often that's what ends in beatings and murders, sadly.
Right. So I wanted to, even though I think you're quite famous here in the UK, did want to touch a bit on your personal journeys. Hannah, you grew up identifying as male, or presenting as male, right? And you joined the UK Army.
Yes.
How old were you when you joined the Army?
So I left home at 16 to go to an army kind of sixth form college where I did my A-levels. They then sponsored me through university, and it was in my kind of early 20s when I finally went to Sandhurst to do my officer training, and I was there for a year. So I've kind of been in the system for about half my life. So it was it's a big part of my growing up and my kind of development as an adult. But it was difficult trying to do all that whilst not being open and true with my own identity, and it's something that I struggled with for many years as I tried to balance what society suspected of me and what I actually felt about myself, and that kind of dichotomy of trying to navigate the world in that situation was difficult, and you have to carry a lot of emotional baggage when you're living that life. It takes energy, it takes effort to pretend to be something you're not for years, and especially when you're under pressure and doing things like military training, that thing becomes even harder. So when I did finally come out, that was a real relief off my shoulders.
You and I have talked about this a little bit, and I've read about this as well, that it was the experience of going to Afghanistan, right, that really, I think, helped propel you over the line to say, I have to make a change.
So when I was growing up, I had a coping mechanism. My coping mechanism was to explore my true identity in private. So behind a locked door, maybe using the internet to connect with people, using an avatar, I would explore my femininity, but then I'd leave it locked behind in that room when I left and went out to society. But when I was in Afghanistan, you don't have the privilege of a locked room or the internet, and so I was living in a space about the size of this stage with 7 men, and that was it. And over that time, lots of periods of time for reflection whilst you're deployed. And so as I lie there, not being able to have my coping mechanism, thinking about my life and where I was and what I was doing, I just felt it was a real struggle for me. Being deployed in Afghanistan was hard enough, but doing it whilst having this pain and this lack of coping mechanism, I found it really difficult. And so I promised myself when I returned that I'd never put myself through that again. And that's when I finally brought up the courage to talk to my chain of command and say, you need to know something about me, I'm transgender.
That was about 5 years ago?
Yeah, 5 or 6 years ago. I generally I can't remember. Right. It seems like a past life sometimes, but yeah.
What was the reaction?
I mean, interestingly, my commanding officer at the time, when I told him I was transgender, the first thing he said was, did you know I'm gay? And I didn't know that, and he was really irritated because he was trying to be out there as a role model, and maybe, maybe if I'd known that he was gay, I would have been more comfortable telling him earlier. And so it just goes to show how those visible role models can really make a difference. But he connected me with the employee resource group, and I met some other people. I got connected with an RAF transgender officer, and she kind of really supported me through. And I found that it was a really positive experience. I found that, I was worried beforehand that I'd lose the respect of my colleagues, and particularly the soldiers I commanded. I was commanding a team of about, 30 to 60 at that time. And so I thought these are young, a lot of them, men from working class backgrounds. What are they going to think about a transgender officer? But in reality, they didn't really care, because what they really care about is, do you deliver my reports on time? Are the orders that you give me, good ones? Are they fair? Are you going to put me in danger? Are you going to do something stupid or ask me to do something I don't want to do? And that's the reality of what people really care about on day-to-day life. But I think the key thing that the Army does, which in terms of really understanding equality, is that you all train for one thing at the end of the day, which is to be in a war zone. And when you're in a war zone and you're potentially fighting for your life, the only thing you care about the person next to you is, can they shoot straight? Can they run fast? And if you need to, can they carry you home to your family? And because of that, I think we cut right through everything from race, gender, sexuality, all of these things, because you don't care about that, you care about those other things. And I think that's why military people can really get over that hurdle of understanding what equality means.
So you alert the command and you begin the process, and then maybe inevitably the media comes knocking. And the story of your public outing, I think, is really interesting.
Well, yeah. So I was actually on a training course. I was with a group of officers doing some training, and I got a phone call from the Army press office saying the Sun have been in touch, and they're aware that you're serving in the Army and you're transgender, and they're going to run a story about you. They want to comment, and I said, well, what do I do? And they said, well, you've got two options. One is that you say no, thank you, and they run their piece, whatever it is, or you say, okay, you talk to them, you give them comments, you give them photographs, but then you have a chance to try and control the story. So for me, it wasn't really a choice. It was a case of you're going to be out there, so you might as well try and make the most of it and try and do something positive with it. So they came and I gave them an interview, and they took pictures, and they got old pictures, and they put me on the front page, and it was a bit of a moment. I knew it was coming out. I looked on the front pages on the news at like 4 o'clock in the morning. I couldn't sleep at all that night. And then I went into the officers' mess that morning, which is kind of a big kind of like breakfast dining hall area. And everyone was there reading their newspapers. And I walked in, and everyone went quiet and looked up. And then quickly looked down again and carried on eating breakfast. And I sort of politely said, "Can I borrow that newspaper? Just have a read of it." So it was an interesting experience, being on the front page and the phone going off the hook when I was trying to do kind of military training at the time. But it has given me a platform and a voice to try and show a representation of a transgender woman that's really positive. And the fact the Army support me is great, but also that a lot of trans women at that time are being portrayed as lots of long red nails and like big high heels, and I went through that phase of really exploring my femininity and what it meant to me. But the fact that I was doing this kind of still stereotypically masculine job and just saying it doesn't really matter, it's only a small part of me, you are who you are, and that's all that matters.
And she received an MBE in the New Year's Honours List for her work towards LGBT progress within the military, which I think is amazing.
Yep. You recently retired from the Army. You were a captain. You were the highest-ranking transgender officer in the UK Army.
Yeah, I was. I left a few months ago now.
Right. Into private business now. So, Jake, I've read that you began your transition about 11 years ago. Mm-hmm. But obviously, this was something that you grappled with, I think, from a very young age, right?
Yeah, I grew up in 1980s London and knew my mother tells me as soon as I could speak, for about 18 months, 2 years, I knew there was something different about me. I knew I didn't look like all the other little boys. And obviously when there's something wrong, when there's something different, then you're very aware of it. And I would tell my mum and dad that I was a boy from the age, from that age, about 2.5, all throughout school. Obviously there was no resources back then. There was no charities to help. There was, the word transgender wasn't even used. It was transsexual at best, and certainly never with any positive connotations. And I looked around and couldn't see any men like me, and just felt there was something obviously seriously wrong with me. But I knew that that's who I was, and I was bullied at school. I had quite short hair because I had curly hair, and I used to beg my mum to let me wear it short, which she did. But that obviously meant that I looked quite like a little boy. So, even the little things like going into the bathrooms at school, girls would scream, boys would laugh. It was, it was quite difficult, obviously, when you're sort of 5 or 6 years old. And the older kids would all bully me, and I knew who I was, but obviously my parents had no inkling. Just thought that maybe I was a difficult child. They'd say to me, "Don't be so silly, darling. Of course you're not. You're our little girl." And my mother would put me into increasingly pinker and frillier. The pinker the better, the frillier the better. And obviously that made for quite a difficult, formative years up to the age of, I guess, 9 or 10, when obviously you learn that people don't want to hear it anymore. And so you squash it down. And with that, you are building on this feeling of low self-esteem, self-doubt, self-loathing. Puberty hits and it all goes out the window, because obviously your body that, previously was at least livable suddenly becomes completely alien to you. And I just became a very, very angry, very unhappy teenager. I pushed away my mother and my father and my younger sister. I was angry. I didn't understand why no one was helping me or listening to me. And, life was very, very difficult. And at about 16, when I discovered alcohol and drugs and so on, that sort of became a way of coping for the next 10 years of my life. And, it was finding oblivion. It wasn't because I wanted to do this. It was the only way that I could get from one day to the next was to sort of, do it in some state of numbness. And it was only when I was 25 years old and I went to New York for the first time and met another transgender man for the first time. And I thought, oh my God, I'm not, because I'd lived as a lesbian for 10 years. I thought, I'm not actually a lesbian. This is what I am. And this guy took me under his wing and talked me through hormones and surgeries and how society would perceive me differently and how friends and family would treat me differently. And I came back to the UK and within a year had started my medical transition. My mother was incredibly supportive, as were all my friends. And the change within about 18 months of testosterone and having my top surgery, and for the first time in my life, being able to walk down the street and feel proud and feel comfortable in my own skin, it was like night and day. Honestly, it was the biggest relief I can imagine. And almost as soon as that happened, I started writing, I started making films, I found my voice, I found a visibility, and I've been lucky enough to tell my story all across the world, in the White House, in the House of Commons, and obviously through that visibility, I met my beautiful wife 3 years ago. So it just showed with support, trans people can really, truly flourish and have a very, very bright future.
So I'm going to skip over a little bit more of the history. You proposed to Hannah in New York at
in a
Central
boat
Park.
on Central Park Pond, yes.
Right. I think that's when I first actually really became aware of you, because I began following you on Instagram then. And then you were married in 2018, so last year. And I think, again, what's been interesting, and we've talked a little bit about this in the past as well, is you have engaged the media, you've brought them in, sometimes to ill effect or unpleasant effect, your wedding, for example. And is that, why have you been as public?
So I think it's twofold. The first thing is that we know we've got this voice, and we know that people would kill to have our voice, and so we feel like we have a responsibility to use it. And we try and make sure that we're only representing ourselves and a small aspect of the trans or LGBT community, because we are so varied. We can't represent everyone, but I think we feel that responsibility. And secondly, I know it's sometimes unpalatable, but if you only go to left-wing press, or if you're only talking maybe very kind of open-minded forums, then you miss a huge swathe of the population that are still not getting those positive representations. So choosing to use our wedding to tell a story in The Sun, it was a clumsy article in some ways, and it went a direction where we didn't really want it to, but at the end of the day, it still was a positive story about transgender people in love, getting on with their lives, talking about their talents as a filmmaker or their experiences in the army, going out into an audience that maybe isn't used to hearing their stories. And so maybe next time when they hear something really negative, they've got something positive in their mind. At least they think about it more than just assume that all trans people are weirdos or freaks, that maybe sometimes the right-wing press will, ask them to believe that. And so we're just trying to do our best to create a slightly better future, just by being ourselves and being visible. And we know that at some point, our story will become less important, and there'll be younger people who'll come up who've got even more powerful stories to tell, and they'll take the torch. But whilst we're here and people want to listen to us, we're going to try and use our voice to make a difference.
How do you balance, though, having a life? I mean, you want to have children. You're now in the private sector. You are acting. You were in Colette. You were in the Danish Girl, and in other films, in your own films, and you're writing, I believe, a book, right?
Oh, no, I'm writing my first feature film at the moment.
Your first feature, right, okay. So how do you balance that with the activism that you're doing?
I mean, honestly, it's always busy, but I remember when I was young and I'd be locked away in my bedroom just feeling miserable and looking out at the world, I think, what Hannah and I have now is beyond my wildest dreams. I never thought I would amount to anything. I never thought my life would matter. I never honestly thought that I'd make it this far, to be perfectly honest. And when we see people like, Gillette and so on, putting their heads above the parapet, and the change that elicits, and great people like you in this room who are all kind of here and hopefully will go off and spread the positivity and so on that you've heard and seen today. It really is important to put ourselves out there. And if that means that we're busy, and if that means that, when we very rarely have a Saturday night when Hannah will go, what have we got today? And I'll say nothing, and literally the euphoria we feel because we've got nothing on. But then, obviously we're very proud patrons of the Mermaids charity. When we go to these retreats, the kids are glad we're there, but the kids don't really care because the kids are off doing kid things. But it's the parents that we talk to, and you know, when these parents come to us, and much, you know, my own mother, when I came out as trans, she was supportive, but she was desperately worried because much as I did, she worried if I'd ever find love, if anyone would want to be with me again, if I'd be safe walking down the street, if I'd have any kind of job or future or prospects. And if all we can do, if the main thing that we can do is reassure those parents and give them hope that their daughter or their son or their non-binary child can find hope and can find happiness and can find love and have a productive, successful life, then that surely kind of eradicates any feeling of, oh, God, we're so busy all the time. Because honestly, it is the biggest honor to be in the position that we're in.
But part of also walking the lines that you have to walk in your various activities, I think within the LGBTQ community, it can also be tricky, right? You know, you've had experiences, you identified as a lesbian for a while, for many years, and then you were a man, and
I also had a boyfriend as a man, so
right.
I mean, I've been very lucky. I mean, as a writer, I've been very lucky because, you know, I lived as a lesbian for 10 years, and then I obviously came out. So I came out as a lesbian. Mum was all right about it. Came out as a trans guy. Mum was like, okay, great. Then I had a boyfriend that came out as a gay man. She was like, Christ, what next? I think I've pretty much done it all. But, you know, from a writing position, great. But, you know, it's been a very interesting experience to obviously see life as a gay man, life as a lesbian, life as a trans, fairly visible couple, and I can attest that, you know, life as a gay man was easily the hardest and the most fearful that I've felt, being on the subway and holding your boyfriend's hand. Nothing compares to it. People are very visibly, quite often, and this is even in central London, quite sort of negative and quite, there's a lot of bigotry out there and a lot of prejudice. But I think, you know, it's an amazing experience, and it does make us both very sad now, the divisions within that community, because there really is, you know, we have, fair enough, we've all been put together under the big rainbow umbrella, but, you know, and obviously there is, I want more visibility. You've taken my visibility. Why are you there and why are we there? And why do you have all the bars and we don't have all the bars? And this is something that's been raging within the LGBT community for years. But I think, you know, what we all forget when we're having these spats, and they're nothing more than spats, but unfortunately they can become very vitriolic, is that when push comes to shove, we are all being attacked and bullied and beaten and vilified by the same people. And that without that unity and without that strength together, you know, we are very weak, particularly the trans community, because I think we're 0.1% of the population. You know, we need to be banding together. We need to be standing up for each other.
Hannah, you've experienced life, obviously, as a man and as a woman. Are there major differences in how people perceive you and that you've noticed?
I mean, yes, definitely. I mean, I think I was an engineer as well, so I found that quite strange. As a female engineer, my voice was less valued. I find that really strange. You know, my opinion went from, you know, here to here, and I find that very strange. But because also I have experienced life as a man, and I was, you know, taught to be myself and be confident and talk up in meetings, etc., I kind of mitigate that. So it's a balancing act, but there is definitely a visible difference in the way that women and men are treated. But I think as a society we're starting to get better at calling it out, and definitely things like the Gillette advert that we just seen is a really good example. But I think there is work to be done, but I think we are getting there. I think women are being way more vocal and standing up for ourselves. But then equally, you're only going to look across what's going on in Alabama right now in the US, and so there's a lot of hard work to do. But there is a difference. Absolutely, there's a difference.
One quick question I wanted to ask you about America is, you must have friends in the US military who now, because of the policy of President Trump, has effectively banned transgender people from serving. What are you hearing from them?
I mean, it's absolutely. I mean, it's shocking and it's wrong. And you know, UK is just one example where we've had open transgender service since 1999. There have been many studies, including in the US under the Obama administration, that have proved that being inclusive of everyone, you know, but specifically trans people, strengthens your force, not weakens it. And it is very clear to me that that policy is based on hatred. It's based on appealing to a certain base of the population of the US and has nothing to do with military effectiveness. And I hope that we find a way to get over it as soon as possible, because in the meantime, there are good, patriotic people who have put their lives on the line for that country, who are now being told that their service doesn't matter, and that's wrong.
What's next for you two personally?
Today we're off to Reading University to give the annual Wolfenden lecture in about an hour. But sort of more broadly, I'm writing my first feature film. We are working towards hopefully starting a family, which obviously for both of us is an absolute dream. And we just want to, I guess, I don't like using the word normal because what does normal mean? But I guess it would be lovely to get to a point where we don't have to talk about being trans, where we don't have to talk about the fight and so on and so forth, where we'll be at a place where we've just kind of got to that point and we're all accepted and it's just okay to be who we are. And as opposed to being trans people, we're just people. So that's kind of on a broader level.
All right. Well, thank you both, Hannah and Jake.
Thank you for having us.
Really appreciate
Thank you so much
coming.
for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.